In the middle of my family's lake. You tore up the land, ignored our property records, and now you're blaming me because the water came back? This was never your land.
My family had owned the lake for 3 generations. Then an HOA built 37 luxury villas on land that wasn't theirs. And the strangest part? For years, there was no water there. The lake had disappeared almost 20 years earlier after a massive flood control project changed the natural drainage system. What remained was a huge basin of dry land. Surrounded by forest and old family property, everyone called it the Dead Lake. My grandfather never did. He always insisted the water would return someday. After he passed away, I inherited the property. I planned to restore the old boathouse, clear the shoreline, and turn the land into a private family retreat. Then, one summer, I discovered construction crews on the far side of the basin. At first, I thought they had permission. Then I saw the sign, "Coming Soon, Lakeside Villas, 37. Luxury homes were being built across the old lakebed. I drove straight to the construction office. A woman named Karen Whitmore introduced herself as president of the new HOA. She handed me a brochure showing beautiful villas, private docks, walking trails, and a planned community pool. I asked one question: who gave you permission to build here? Karen smiled. The development company purchased the property. From whom? She hesitated, then she said, the land was abandoned. I pulled out my deed. The entire lake basin was still listed as part of my family's property. Karen looked at it and laughed. That document doesn't mean you control everything underneath the development. I stared at her. Actually, it does. She became irritated. She claimed the old lake bed had been classified as unusable land and that the HOA had obtained development rights years earlier. But when I checked the county records, something didn't add up. The development company had purchased several surrounding parcels, not mine. They had simply built right up to my property boundaries. Then they started building roads across the old basin. The first villas went up quickly, one after another. By winter, 23 were complete. By spring, all 37 stood in rows, across what had once been the bottom of my family's lake. I sent the HOA a formal notice. They ignored it. Then Karen sent me a letter. It said I was prohibited from entering the development because I was interfering with HOA operations. I couldn't believe it. They had built a neighborhood on my family's land and were now telling me I couldn't walk across it. I hired a surveyor. The results were shocking. The original property boundary ran directly through the development. Several villas appeared to be sitting partially over my family's property, but there was another problem. My grandfather's old records contained maps from before the lake disappeared. Those maps showed something nobody in the development seemed to know. A natural channel ran directly beneath the new neighborhood. It connected the basin to an upstream river. My grandfather had written one sentence across the map: if the old channel ever reopens, the lake will return. I thought it was just an old man's theory. Then, one night, a storm hit the mountains. Rain poured for hours. The next morning, I drove toward the development water. Was flowing through the old channel, not a trickle. River! I called my surveyor. He looked at the footage. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. Get ready. For what? The lake. By sunset, water had begun collecting beneath the 37 villas, and Karen Whitmore had absolutely no idea what was coming. The next morning, the development looked completely different. Water covered the lowest section of the old lake bed. It surrounded several unfinished roads and had reached the foundations of multiple villas. Residents stood outside their houses, filming everything on their phones. Karen was screaming at construction crews, "Get the pumps running!" But the pumps couldn't keep up. Water was entering from underground channels and flowing downhill from the reopened natural drainage path. I stood on the edge of my family's property watching the basin slowly transform. The dead lake was coming. Back! Karen spotted me. This is your fault! I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My fault? You knew this would happen! No, my grandfather did. I showed her the old map. She stared at the blue lines marking the original water channel. Then she went pale. The development's engineers arrived that afternoon. They examined the terrain, the old survey records, and the drainage system. Their conclusion was brutal. The villas had been constructed in a historical flood basin. The original drainage patterns had never been properly accounted for, and several structures had been placed directly across the natural watercourse. The HOA immediately tried to blame the county. The county blamed the developer. The developer blamed outdated maps, but none of them could explain why they had ignored my family's recorded property boundaries. Then the county surveyor made another discovery. Several of the villas weren't just near my property. Parts of their foundations crossed onto it. The HOA had accidentally built structures on land they didn't own. Karen's confidence disappeared. She demanded that I sell the affected portion of the property. I refused. Then she offered money. I refused again. Finally, she asked what I wanted. I pointed toward the lake. I want my property back exactly as it was. Within weeks, emergency officials ordered portions of the development evacuated while engineers evaluated the site. The water continued rising. The streets became channels. The empty spaces between villas turned into small coves. The 37 luxury homes that had been advertised as lakeside living were now literally surrounded by the lake they had been built beside. Only this lake wasn't supposed to exist. The developer eventually admitted that the original environmental and hydrological studies had relied on incomplete historical data. Legal battles followed. The HOA dissolved its board and hired attorneys. Several homeowners filed claims against the developer, and the county opened an investigation into how the construction permits had been approved. My family, meanwhile, went to court over the property boundaries. Months later, the ruling came. The land belonging to my family remained ours. Structures that crossed those boundaries couldn't simply become HOA property because someone had built them there. The parties eventually reached a settlement that required the developer to compensate my family and relocate several structures that could not safely remain. The HOA also lost control over portions of the development, but the biggest surprise came later. The lake stabilized. It wasn't exactly the same size as the lake my grandfather remembered, but it was real. Fish returned. Waterfowl appeared. The old boathouse, which had survived decades of abandonment, stood once again beside the water. One evening, I sat on its dock and looked across the lake. 37 luxury villas stood along the shoreline. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had spent millions trying to create a lakeside community. They just never expected the lake to actually come back. And my grandfather? He had been right all along. Sometimes land remembers what people try to forget. And sometimes when you build on the wrong piece of history, the water comes back to collect what was taken.